Marsha Ferber, Marsha Mud Ferber, as she was known in West Virginia, was one of my best friends. And she was this short bundle of energy, charismatic, funny as hell, sassy, smart, human being who was absolutely committed to building a better world and creating businesses and endeavors that were unlike what we saw in the world that our parents and grandparents had built. Was based on generosity and sharing and kindness and getting people engaged and helping them feel their power and empowered. And she was someone who loved young people and really wanted them to feel safe and help them find their voice and their power. She was a really special person. And she made everybody think that they were her best friend.
One of the many things that we've learned about Marsha on this journey that we've gone on, sort of telling her story and our own story through this podcast, is that Marsha was very good at compartmentalizing, and we kind of see her world as a big house. And a house has a lot of rooms. And Marsha's house had a lot of rooms. And you might be invited to this room, and someone else was invited to this room, and someone else was invited to this room, and maybe you could go into 2 different rooms. But it was very rare that anyone that we have talked to was able to go into every single room. So my mom was one of her best friends, but still only had access to some of the rooms. And so it would be impossible to know every single thing about her, even if you thought you were her best friend, which many people did. That's kind of how she lived, and I think partially to protect people. I mean, let's be honest, she was selling weed. That was part of what sustained the business.
A very honorable profession, in my opinion.
Which is now legal in many places, but in the 1970s and 80s it wasn't.
We were way ahead of the curve. Seriously. We knew it was a magical herb with medicinal properties and consciousness-raising possibilities. It was, the fact that it was illegal always felt like the crime to us.
Now marijuana is a big part of the economy. So it was then too, but it was illegal. And unfortunately, Marsha didn't just sell weed and didn't just smoke weed. It did kind of seep over or leak over into harder drugs.
You know, I did think I knew her really well. I still think I know her really well. I think I know her heart. And one of the big learnings for me in doing this podcast, I was never there, is really grappling with how Marsha has folk hero status here. I mean, she changed people's lives and they hold on to her as this folk hero. And she was a folk hero. It's interesting to me, however, that we put people in these positions or put them on pedestals without having a full picture of who they really are. So Marsha was a complicated person. Most of us are a complicated person. I would hazard a guess that you're a complicated person, right? That we all hold some good and some not so good, some complicated, some simple. She held all of that. So have we learned a lot about Marsha that we didn't know fully? Yes. Are there things in this podcast that surprised us? In some cases shocked us? Yes. But I still feel like I know her heart.
Our goal was not to tear down this folk hero image. It was to present an honest, loving portrait of a complicated human being. One of the things that Marsha did when she was living in Morgantown was she was volunteering with Jewish prisoners at the Kennedy Center. Marsha was Jewish. They used to get out and come to the Earth House and smoke pot and hang out. They were supposed to be taking classes, and then after their classes they were supposed to go back, but they'd go back to the Earth House and hang out. So, many of whom were in for nonviolent crimes, or art theft, drugs, all young guys, many of whom were not from Morgantown, and they all had this connection through Judaism, although many of them weren't religious. It was more of a...
Some even weren't Jewish at a certain point, but...
It was more of a kind of cultural connection.
But they wanted to protect Marsha in case they got caught for being at the Earth House when they weren't supposed to be there. Yeah, so they would make her stand in front of the mirror and practice saying, I was never there. Wasn't me.
And actually when we talk, because there's so many parts to this podcast and to this story, that also do involve drugs or fun stories or sex or, many times throughout the podcast, someone would say to us, I was never there. So it just felt like very fitting for the story, and that's where the title came from.